Hello there everybody, so this is going to be a first. As it's my birthday today, I'd like to do a post hoc analysis on the art piece that I recently revealed titled Enzo Dragon. And one of the reasons for doing this is because for me as the artist, it's a good exercise to reconcile what's been made back to the mind. It's a bit like having a child. You don't simply give birth to something and then leave it alone. You attend to it, you learn from it, and from that education, you begin to appreciate the wider dynamics of what exactly has been called out from you. And second of all, I think it's interesting for you to learn about where I'm coming from as an artist. I always have to remind myself that this is an arts and humanities project, and sometimes it seems to me at least that we always return to talking about the humanities and the art gets left behind, so this will be a good opportunity to talk about both equally. I suppose I should start off by saying that one of the central axioms upon which XELASOMA is based is the view that images contain a power to alter subjective experience, and through that altering of subjective experience, we're given over to a wider appreciation of life and ourselves that can be conducive in the healing process. This healing process is a reaction to what I consider to be as the primary existential dilemma of mankind, a dilemma that's been exaggerated tremendously since the industrial age, and which has spawned a myriad of responses that, however different with respect to philosophy and practice, each seek to address the same fundamental issue, that of being a complex organism with a complex psychological ecosystem, without a comprehensive means to reconcile that complexity back to its own systems. Traditionally, this has been mediated somewhat by various religious and cultural practices that have sought to reconcile human consciousness to both its inner and outer life, but these too have found disfavour in the eyes of the contemporary priesthood, whose own solutions only seem to exacerbate the issue rather than rectify it. In addition to this is something that I say a lot, which is that man is a stratified creature, meaning that each of us carries as part of its inheritance a series of residual markers that speak to prior states of life, and this is reflected not only in our genetics but also in how we intuitively gravitate towards modes of being and relating to phenomena that speak to older patterns of behaviour seen vigorously in peoples and cultures that we consider as remotely different to us. And it's for these two primary reasons why XELASOMA exists. We recognise that what we are today forms part of a continuum, and that what we create in the now has the power to shape us into what we might be tomorrow. And this is where art comes into the picture. Art has the power to inform our understanding of ourselves precisely because it arises from the activities of our own life, and once realised, returns back into the currents of that life to influence its arrangement. When we look at an image, we're not merely interpreting sense data. We also recognise additional content such as memories, moods, and value judgments that speak directly to what we are. And what's more, they were not available until that image provoked them to appear inside us. Looking into a work of art is sometimes like looking into a magic mirror, like the one the sorceress uses in Sleeping Beauty. And if we converse with that mirror, we learn not only about the nature of our relationship to the image, but also at a far more intimate level, we make contact with aspects of our own nature that are calling out to be accepted into consciousness, and that's what facilitates the healing component. So with that preliminary in mind, we can proceed to look at the core motifs in this artwork. First of all, let's identify the motifs. We have a humanoid figure in the upper middle which appears to be conjoined to the figure of a dragon. The dragon itself embodies multiple characteristics. The reptile, serpent features are present. Also, if we look closely at the eyes, we notice that it possesses the eyes of a spider. In contrast to its upper half, the dragon's lower half is incredibly distorted, giving way to a mangle of tentacle-like appendages and a deformed, clawed foot. The dragon seems to be in a state of inconsistency or incompletion. Then, arriving at the centre, we can see what appears to be a black vortex, which is coiled beneath the dragon's clubbed finger. Also, we have what looks like green energy surrounding the vortex, which is interacting with the deformed part of the dragon's lower body. The reason why I said it only appears to be a vortex will be explained later on. And finally, we have an ambiguous element protruding from the dragon's snout. I say it's ambiguous because, in my frame of reference, I can regard it at once in an organic or an inorganic context. On one level, it reminds me of those bioluminescent protrusions that you sometimes see extending from the heads of the anglerfish. Then again, given the cultural reference of this motif, it could just as easily be interpreted as a black fire emanating from the dragon's snout. Personally, I err more towards the anglerfish idea as it makes the design more interesting to me, but I wanted to include all considerations in the name of thoroughness. Alright then, so now that we've identified all of the primary motifs in this image, let's say something more general about the art as part of a whole family of images and motifs. This artwork, Enzo Dragon, is like all of my other images in the sense that it forms part of a continuum. This goes back to what I was saying earlier about how we form part of a continuum of life and ideas that permeate through our lives into the present, and naturally the things that crystallize out from our life, like works of art such as this one, follow in the same pattern. This is the justification for why we can read into works of art as a psychobiography of the artist, because what they represent derived from the life patterns of the artists themselves. And speaking to that, I'm reminded of what Jordan Peterson said about Jung's notion of human minds being the incubators of historical ideas, which also makes us the incubators of the minds who form those ideas. We like to think of ourselves as these unique specimens, which we are in respects to our unique configuration and the perspective that we have from our vantage in time, but we're not in possession of that much originality. It's more like we're mosaics of patterns that have already been woven throughout other human lives, and those other human lives were themselves mosaics of the patterns that preceded them, and so on. And I like that way of thinking about humans and information as a constantly weaving mosaic. It has echoes of the Greek Moirai, the weaving goddesses. The fates weave destiny into the lives of human beings, and human beings, by secondary effect, weave those various informational patterns into the life systems that they create around them. So by thinking about art in this way, we can see how the art that we create is also like a mosaic that is drawn together from the strands of cultural influence, historical movements, evolved inheritance, even down to the very ways that our brain interprets things like light and geometry. And also, of course, we have to include the specific memory imprints of the artist as another strand. And all of this great confluence of interest weaves together into the mosaic tapestry of any given work of art. And it's interesting because sometimes we don't consciously realise the patterns in what we're doing until we're so far down the line of repeating the same process that it finally reveals itself. It actually wasn't until 2017, when I made an artwork called Gehenna, that I was struck by an epiphany that since the inception of my project, I'd been making the same image. Several years down the line, many artworks later, and I still hadn't realised that. Now granted, I wasn't literally making the same image over and over and over, that isn't what I mean. What I was doing is re-articulating or reweaving the same core patterns and motifs into new variations of my art. So now when I look at a piece like Enzo Dragon, I can easily spot these motifs now because I've become conscientious of them. And for all of those years, the reason why I wasn't conscientious of them was because I wasn't having a conscientious relationship with my art. So to properly understand this visually, let's look at the first image that I created under the XELASOMA moniker, titled The Sorcerer. So what we can see here is a relatively simple image if you ignore all the complexity of line work and just break it down into the constituent motifs. If we follow from the right side and work our way backwards, what we have is a humanoid figure holding its hands up to what might be interpreted as a mask with a long beak-like structure. And this mask is having some effect on the humanoid because out from the back of his head extends all of this organic undulation of form life all the way back to the far left of the piece. And within that form life, we can see what seems like various animal or invertebrate appendages, organic patterns, some semblances of faces even. So we have our core motifs here. We have a humanoid figure, the mind as flesh, and animal forms. Also, if you notice, there's another motif that might also be relevant. All of the structures are connected. There are very few disembodied elements in any of my artworks. Everything is in some way conjoined to everything else into a unified system. And so this image set not only a signature foundation for my aesthetic style, it also laid down a series of core motifs that would come to re-articulate through the other images that I made in the future. So fast forward all the way to 2017 when I made Gehenna, and now what do we see? Humanoid figure, the mind extending into flesh. Predatory animal forms. Here we have reptiles, 2 spiders, and if we zoom out in perspective, all of them are forming into the body of a giant squid, which is also the personification of the extended psyche of the humanoid. And also, of course, we have the interconnectedness of subject at every level. The same core motifs that were present when I made The Sorcerer all the way back in, I think it was 2012, are still present in this one. But wait, we also have a new motif here, don't we? Because if we look up to the middle at the top end of the piece, what do we have here? We have a black solar motif surrounded by a halo of fire. This solar motif, and the fire element as well, started to emerge very early in the XELASOMA timeline. However, it wasn't until later on that I realised its prominence in the imagery and its possible psychohistorical connotations. Now we have to take all of this and import it back into Enzo Dragon. So with all that preliminary in place, it should now be obvious to see that Enzo Dragon forms part of a continuum of signature aesthetics and motifs. In fact, this piece could really be seen as a recalibration of Gehenna only 2 years prior. We have the humanoid figure diminished into the central horizon. We have the predatory animal forms, with the reptile being exaggerated over the octopoid, which is still present in a sense, just in a disfigured, slightly less explicit way down in the lower portion of the piece. And the spiders are still present in the eyes of the dragon. And most significantly, we have the cosmic element of the black sun dead center with the green halo of fire surrounding it. So what might this reoccurring confluence of motifs signify? Well, there's an easy answer to answer that, and there's a more complicated way of answering that. The easy way of answering that is simply to say that I like this style of imagery. All of these elements, from the animal forms to the biomorphic aesthetic to the cosmic elements, are all part of a family of aesthetic languages that I have an emotional affection for. And all of these are in some way reconfigurations of various visual cues that my mind has been consciously stimulated by before. I can resonate with the patterns of animals in the nature documentaries that I liked to watch as a boy. I can resonate with the dragons that I used to read about in fantasy literature. I can even detect a bit of Akira in this with the mutative flesh type reference. I can always resonate with those influences that have inspired me the most with artists such as H.R. Giger. You notice how in this image on screen, how certain figures seem to be embedded into the structure of the walls, just like how in my piece, how the humanoid's body is united into the figure of the dragon per se. So yeah, all of these things ring true for me when I try to trace back the aesthetic lineages that have helped to inform this visually. So now let's go beyond that and look at this symbolically. If this was a magic mirror, what might this be reflecting back to us about the artist? Well, when we're making these kind of evaluations, we need to activate the parts of our mind that are going to successfully forge those associations to other parts of our memory. So what I'm talking about here is giving the intellect a break and engaging more with our powers of intuition. Jung spoke about intuition in reference to dream interpretation, and he said that Westerners need to start seeing intuition as an untapped skill that needs to be cultivated if we're going to be successful in interpreting our dreams. And I think this equally applies to when we're interpreting art as a psychological mirror in this way. So let's start with the recurrence of these predator forms then. Now, I've already mentioned that I like the visual styles of these animals, so we're not going to include that in here. We're just thinking about it in relation to what our connection to these motifs might communicate about how our mind reads into life. So one way to interpret this that rings true to me would be to say that part of the reason why these predatory forms reoccur so much in my art is because my mind interprets life as a predator. And this resonates with me because I'm actually quite a shy and reclusive person, and part of the reason why I'm that way is because human interaction takes a lot out of me. It's exhausting to me. So in most cases, human interaction creates a lot of stress for me, and I need to retreat away from that interaction to recuperate myself. And one more byproduct of that is that I often find myself in a state of hyper-alertness about the potentiality of human interaction. So human interaction becomes associated in my mind as a kind of danger, as a kind of threat. So think about how this might give itself over to representation. One way that we might conceive of that is to think of it like life is like a predator. And if you're an artist, you possess an ability to translate the existential effect that you receive from life over into imagistic representation. So it doesn't seem like a stretch to me, picking up from what this image is saying to me, that one of the ways that I relate to life is that life is like a predator. And as part of that, I'm also saying that I am its prey. And that tells me something very fundamental about the way that I as a being relate to existence. So let's move on to another motif. The next one that I want to analyse is this humanoid pygmy creature in the centre that's joined up to the dragon. This imp is called Enzo, and I know that because here's another little piece of trivia about XELASOMA. I don't think about the titles for my art, rather a lot of my creative execution is predicated upon a faith that I have in the deeper parts of my unconscious to already have this stuff figured out, before my conscious mind can catch up with it. So I just leave myself open to suggestion and allow things to ruminate and flow into the creative process when they're ready to be hatched, so to speak. So I could have a finished art piece for weeks and I won't really stress about a name until one day I'll be doing something really mundane and I'll receive a voice that says Enzo Dragon or Gehenna, and pregnant within that name will be an association to the art. And that's how I name all my pieces. I just let the unconscious name them. And so in this case, the mantle of Enzo Dragon derives from the dragon part, obviously, and this Enzo creature that somehow united to the life of this dragon, hence Enzo Dragon. And so now I have the problem of figuring out why it's united and what might be the significance of that. And what I strongly receive from Enzo is that, well, first of all, he's an imp because he's diminutive and he's also got that slouched posture to him like Gollum in Lord of the Rings. What I really get from him, though, is that he is an embodiment of my own identification with weakness. Enzo is my insecurity, my meekness, my apprehensiveness to meet goals, my lack of belief in myself. He is a composite of everything that keeps me limited to an inferior point of view about myself. He is the embodiment of my resistance to transcend my own limits. And this is a side of my nature that I'm very much in communion with every week, because life is always forwarding opportunities my way that could lift me out of the patterns of inertia that I have made for myself, and so often I refuse that call because it's not convenient, or I can't be bothered, or here's one, it would take me out of the familiar. And another thing that's interesting about Enzo is that he has 6 eyes, and the dragon who he's united with would also have 6 eyes. So they not only share the same body, they possess the same scope of vision. I only have 2 eyes, so all I can see is this reality. But these creative creatures possess more eyes, so they have a more intimate understanding of me than I do about myself, which is why I need to call upon their insight in this art to peer into those patterns of my activity that are blind in my perspective. And now finally, why is Enzo conjoined to the dragon in this way? What's the significance of that? Well, taking into consideration all that's already been said, that's quite easy for me to answer. Enzo and the dragon share the same life because my weakness is in a relationship with another aspect of me that the dragon represents. And that is what you could say is my bestial nature. It's my capacity for aggression and assertiveness. This is another way of looking at the dragon. The dragon in mythology is a composite of various animal forms, all of them predatory, all of them powerful in some way. And people who possess a strong identification with their weak side, or their unrealized potential, so to speak, they naturally gravitate to power motifs that reflect back impressions of their own nature that they have yet to actualize. We see this a lot in escapist literature and video games, where you see a lot of these nerdy guys who are quite shy and timid in their personal lives, and they form these strong psychological bonds with characters that represent dimensions of human expression that they would like to actuate in themselves. And for me, this dragon, in fact dragons in general when I was growing up, left a big psychological impression over me. And I think at least part of the reason for that was because they represented a primal power that I felt in touch with, but didn't feel confident in actuating. So if the dragon can be seen as this embodiment of primal power, and Enzo as the embodiment of an inner identification with weakness, then the uniting of these two motifs into the same life pattern signifies the mitigating effect that the imp has on the dragon to convert primal aggression into assertiveness and confident action in life. And that's what this is symbolizing for me, definitely. This piece is really about the dysfunctional interaction between weakness and primal potential. I think that that's what this is really about. The only thing that I've left out is the inclusion of the black sun. But I don't think I'm going to talk about that in this video. I think I'm going to leave that for another video. I'd really like to go through more mirror exercises like this with some of the other artworks that I've done and apply the same filters to them, because this is a really good exercise and it really helps to ground a lot of the things that I say about art and psychology in a new context. So what do you think? Would you like me to do more analysis videos like this where I occasionally just take one of my art pieces and apply this kind of analysis to them? I think that that would be really interesting. So yeah, I think I'm going to leave it at that for this video. I think I've said everything that I wanted to about this piece. Yeah, thank you very much for watching, and as usual, I'll see you again.